Robert Hayes had been mopping the same hallway in the Tech Vision Industries building for 17 years, invisible to most employees who hurried past him without a glance. But what none of them knew, as they dismissed him as just the janitor, was that Robert had taught himself advanced mathematics, computer programming, electrical engineering, and systems architecture through thousands of library books and online courses during his night shifts, driven by a hunger for knowledge that poverty and circumstance had denied him the chance to pursue formally. And on the morning when the new CEO, Amanda Sterling, called an emergency executive meeting to address the catastrophic system failure that was costing the company millions of dollars per hour, Robert was quietly emptying trash cans in the conference room, listening to the panic in their voices as the highest-paid engineers in the building admitted they couldn't identify the problem. And when Robert gently suggested he might know what was causing the cascading failure in their automated production system, Amanda had turned to him with an expression of such withering contempt that the entire room fell silent. And she'd said, in a voice dripping with condescension, "You don't even have a degree. What could you possibly know about complex engineering systems? Please finish your cleaning and let the actual professionals handle this." And Robert had felt the familiar sting of being dismissed for lacking credentials, rather than being evaluated on his capabilities. The same sting he'd felt his entire life. But what Amanda didn't know was that Robert had designed a nearly identical system in his workshop at home, had identified a critical flaw in the architectural approach that professional engineers had missed because they were following conventional wisdom rather than questioning fundamental assumptions. And as he quietly left the conference room with his cleaning cart, he heard the lead engineer say they might need to shut down production entirely for weeks, costing the company its biggest client and potentially hundreds of jobs. And Robert faced a choice that would define not just his own future, but the futures of all his coworkers who depended on this company for their livelihoods. Robert had grown up in foster care, bouncing between homes that ranged from neglectful to barely adequate, never staying anywhere long enough to build the academic record that colleges required for admission. And by the time he aged out of the system at 18, he had a GED, but no family, no money, no connections, and no path to higher education. So he'd taken the only job he could find, night janitor, at a small tech startup that would eventually become Tech Vision Industries. And, while others saw his position as a dead end, Robert saw it as an opportunity to learn, spending his breaks reading technical manuals left on engineers' desks, teaching himself programming languages from discarded textbooks, and gradually, painstakingly, building an education through sheer determination and the belief that knowledge itself mattered more than the credentials that supposedly certified it. He'd watched the company grow from 20 employees to 2,000, had cleaned the offices of 3 previous CEOs who'd at least acknowledged his existence with polite nods, had seen brilliant innovations and spectacular failures, and through it all, he'd absorbed everything, understanding the company's systems more intimately than people who'd designed them, because he'd been there for every iteration, every upgrade, every patch and modification, and he'd noticed patterns that others missed because they were too focused on their specialized areas to see the larger interconnected picture. Amanda Sterling had arrived 3 months ago as the new CEO, brought in by the board to modernize and streamline operations, and she'd immediately implemented changes that prioritized credentials over experience, formal education over practical knowledge, and she'd made it clear in staff meetings that she valued people with impressive degrees from prestigious universities. People like herself, who'd gone to Harvard Business School and believed that institutional validation was the only measure of competence. And she'd looked at the longtime employees, the ones who'd built this company through dedication and skill, and seen them as obsolete, as obstacles to her vision of a sleeker, more professional organization. The system failure that was currently crippling the company had started small 3 days ago, a minor glitch that the engineering team had patched quickly, but Robert had noticed something in the error logs he'd seen on a discarded printout, a pattern that suggested the patch hadn't addressed the root cause but had actually created a more dangerous instability. And he'd tried to mention it to one of the junior engineers, who'd dismissed him with a patronizing smile and a reminder that we have protocols for reporting technical issues, and they don't include input from janitorial staff. And now that instability had cascaded into complete system failure. The automated production lines frozen, the quality control systems offline, and millions of dollars in orders sitting unfulfilled while the client threatened to take their business elsewhere permanently. Robert finished his morning cleaning route and returned to his small basement workshop, a storage room that previous management had let him convert into a personal space, and he looked at the miniature version of Tech Vision's production system that he'd built from salvaged parts and donated equipment, a scale model that he'd used to teach himself how industrial automation worked. And he pulled up the diagnostic interface he'd created and ran the same error sequence that was plaguing the company's actual system. And within 15 minutes, he'd identified the problem, a timing conflict in the Cascade protocol that occurred only when 3 specific subsystems were under simultaneous load, something the engineers had missed because they were testing each subsystem independently rather than looking at the interaction effects. And more importantly, he'd identified the fix's simple adjustment to the priority queue that would resolve the conflict without requiring a complete system shutdown. He sat there for a long moment, holding the solution to a problem that was threatening his coworkers' jobs. And he wrestled with the question of whether to try again, whether to risk another humiliation, whether someone who'd been dismissed so casually had any obligation to help people who'd never valued his contributions. But then he thought about Maria, in accounting, who was supporting 3 kids on her own, about Tom in shipping, who'd just bought his first house, about the 100 other employees who weren't millionaire executives, but were regular people whose lives would be devastated if the company failed. And Robert realized that this wasn't about his pride or Amanda Sterling's respect. It was about doing what was right, regardless of recognition, about using his knowledge to help others even when those others had never helped him. Robert printed out his diagnostic analysis and his proposed solution, documented with the same rigor he'd seen in professional engineering reports. And he took the elevator to the executive floor where Amanda's office dominated the corner, with floor-to ceiling windows that seemed designed to remind everyone of the distance between her position and theirs. And her assistant tried to stop him, saying Ms. Sterling doesn't take unscheduled meetings, especially not from facility staff. But Robert said with quiet determination, "Tell her I can fix the system failure, and if she doesn't want to listen, I'll leave and she can explain to the board why she rejected help, because it came from someone without the right credentials." The assistant, clearly flustered, disappeared into Amanda's office, and a moment later returned with an expression of surprise and said, "She'll give you 5 minutes, but she's already angry about being interrupted." Robert entered the expansive office where Amanda sat behind a desk that probably cost more than his annual salary, her expression oscillating between irritation and curiosity, and she said, "You have 5 minutes to explain why you're wasting my time when I have actual engineers working on this problem." Robert placed his documentation on her desk and said, "The system failure is caused by a timing conflict in the Cascade protocol when subsystems A7, B3, and C9 are under simultaneous load. Your engineers missed it because they're testing components in isolation, and this document shows the diagnostic evidence and the solution, which requires modifying the priority queue, parameter specific. Changes are outlined on page 3 and can be implemented in under an hour without shutting down the entire system." Amanda stared at him like he'd spoken in an alien language, then picked up the documentation and began reading, her expression shifting from skepticism to concentration to something that might have been shock. And she spent 10 minutes reading through his analysis, checking his equations, reviewing his logic, and when she finally looked up, her voice had lost some of its edge. "Where did you learn to do this kind of analysis?" she asked, and Robert said simply, "Books, online courses, 17 years of paying attention. I don't have a degree, Miss Sterling, but I have knowledge, and right now, knowledge is what your company needs." Amanda made a call to her lead engineer, a man named Dr. Harrison Chen, who had 2 PhDs and had been adamant that the solution would take weeks to develop. And when he arrived at her office and saw Robert standing there, his expression showed confusion until Amanda handed him Robert's documentation and said, "Review this and tell me if it's viable." Dr. Chen's face, as he read, was a portrait of emotion, surprise, then embarrassment, then grudging respect, and he finally said, "This is actually brilliant. The cascade conflict analysis is exactly right. We missed it completely because we were looking at each subsystem's architecture independently, and the proposed solution is elegant and implementable. Where did this come from?" Amanda gestured to Robert and said, "Our janitor apparently knows more about our systems than our entire engineering department." And there was still an edge to her voice, but also something else. Something that might have been the beginning of awareness that her assumptions had been dangerously wrong. Dr. Chen looked at Robert with new eyes and said, "Can you walk me through your diagnostic process? I need to understand how you isolated the timing conflict, and for the next 30 minutes. Robert explained his analysis while Dr. Chen listened with the attention of someone recognizing genuine expertise, regardless of its source, asking technical questions that Robert answered with precision. And by the end of that conversation, Dr. Chen said, "Mr. Hayes, would you be willing to consult with my team on implementing this fix? Your understanding of the system integration is deeper than anyone else's, and I want to make sure we do this correctly." Robert agreed, and within 2 hours, the fix was implemented, tested, and deployed, and the production systems came back online smoothly, and the crisis that had threatened the company's survival was resolved by the man who'd been dismissed that morning for lacking credentials. And Amanda Sterling stood in the observation room watching the production lines resume operation, and she was very quiet. The next morning, Amanda called an all-hands company meeting, something she'd never done before, and the employees gathered in the main atrium with the nervous energy of people who expected announcements about layoffs or restructuring. And Amanda took the microphone and said something that surprised everyone. "I owe this company an apology, and I owe one person in particular a profound apology. Yesterday, we faced a crisis that threatened our survival, and the solution came from someone I had dismissed and disrespected based purely on credential prejudice. Robert Hayes has worked here for 17 years, and I never bothered to learn his name or recognize his contributions. I judged him by his job title and his lack of formal degree, and in doing so, I nearly cost this company everything. Robert saved us not because he has a diploma on his wall, but because he has dedicated himself to learning and understanding our systems with a depth that formal education didn't provide to those of us who have degrees. And I'm standing here today to acknowledge that I was wrong about him, about the value of credentials versus knowledge, about what makes someone an expert, and I want to announce that effective immediately. Robert Hayes is being offered the position of Senior Systems Analyst, with full compensation and benefits, because he's earned it through skill and dedication, not through checking boxes on an HR form." The room erupted in applause, and Robert stood there feeling emotion overwhelm him, because this wasn't just about a job title or a salary increase. It was about finally being seen, being valued, being recognized for who he'd made himself into through sheer determination. And when he looked at Amanda, she was crying, actual tears running down her face, and she said into the microphone, "Robert, I'm sorry. Truly sorry for my arrogance and my blindness. You deserved respect long before you saved this company, and I failed to give it to you. Thank you for being a better person than I was, for helping despite how you were treated, And I promise you that I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to do better. The following weeks brought changes to TechVision that rippled through every level of the organization. Amanda worked with HR to revise hiring practices, to value demonstrated skills and experience alongside formal education, creating pathways for people who'd learned through non-traditional means. And she instituted a mentorship program where employees like Robert could share their practical knowledge with recent graduates who had theoretical education but lacked real-world understanding. And she started actually talking to employees at all levels, learning their names, hearing their ideas, discovering that innovation and insight existed everywhere in the company if leadership was willing to listen. Robert settled into his new role with the same quiet competence he'd brought to his janitorial work, but now his insights were welcomed rather than dismissed. His contributions were credited rather than invisible, and he found himself mentoring young engineers, teaching them that the best solutions often came from questioning assumptions and looking at systems holistically rather than through the narrow lens of specialization. He continued to arrive early, but now, instead of mopping floors, he was reviewing system architectures and identifying potential improvements, and the company's performance metrics improved measurably because they were finally utilizing the full depth of Robert's knowledge. And Dr. Chen became his close friend and advocate, telling anyone who would listen that Robert was the most naturally talented systems thinker he'd ever encountered. Degree or no degree, Amanda's transformation was more personal and painful. She had to confront the arrogance that her Ivy League education had instilled, the belief that her credentials made her superior to people who'd learned differently. And she started taking evening courses in humility, metaphorically speaking, seeking out the employees she'd overlooked and actually listening to their experiences and insights. And she learned that the janitor who'd replaced Robert had opinions about building maintenance that could save thousands of dollars, that the cafeteria manager understood supply chain logistics in ways that could improve efficiency. That expertise existed in unexpected places if you respected people enough to discover it. 6 months after the crisis, Amanda asked Robert to join her for coffee, not as boss and employee, but as two people who'd both learned hard lessons. And she said, "I've been thinking about why I was so dismissive of you. And I realized it wasn't really about you at all. It was about my own insecurity. I'd always defined my worth by my achievements and credentials, by the schools I attended and the degrees I earned. And seeing someone who'd learned so much without those validations threatened my entire identity. If you could be brilliant without Harvard, what did my Harvard degree actually mean? I think I dismissed you because accepting your expertise would have meant questioning the foundation of my own self-worth. And that was terrifying. But you taught me something more valuable than anything I learned in business school. That worth isn't conferred by institutions. It's built through dedication, curiosity, and the courage to keep learning even when the world tells you that you don't belong in the conversation." Robert listened and then said something that showed the wisdom he'd gained through years of being underestimated. "I appreciate your apology, Amanda, and I've seen you genuinely trying to change. But I want you to understand something. My whole life I've watched people with degrees get opportunities I was denied, not because they were smarter or worked harder, but because they had access to institutions that I didn't, and that's not fair. But here's what I've learned. The unfairness of that system doesn't mean education is worthless. It means the system needs to expand, to create more pathways for people to develop and demonstrate their knowledge. Your degree wasn't a waste. It gave you tools and opportunities. The problem was that you thought it made you better than people who learned differently. So the lesson isn't that formal education doesn't matter. It's that it's one path among many, and all paths deserve respect." Their conversation led to Amanda championing a scholarship program funded by TechVision that would provide educational opportunities for people from backgrounds like Robert's, working adults who wanted to formalize their self-taught knowledge, foster youth who lacked traditional academic support, anyone who had the hunger to learn, but not the access to traditional institutions. And Robert helped design the program to recognize prior learning and real-world experience, creating bridges between practical knowledge and formal credentials rather than treating them as opposing forces. The local news covered the program and wanted to interview Robert about his story, and he was reluctant at first, private by nature, and uncomfortable with attention. But Amanda encouraged him, saying, "Your story matters. There are thousands of people out there who've given up on their dreams because they think the door is closed without a degree. You can show them that knowledge and determination matter, that there are people who will value what you've taught yourself." And Robert finally agreed, and the interview aired on the evening news. And his phone started ringing with messages from people around the country, people who'd been teaching themselves programming or engineering or mathematics, but thought they'd never be taken seriously. And Robert responded to every message, encouraging them, sharing resources, becoming a mentor to strangers because he remembered what it felt like to hunger for knowledge in isolation. And he wanted others to know they weren't alone. Amanda, watching the impact of Robert's story, started speaking at business conferences about the crisis that had taught her humility, about the danger of credential prejudice, about how her company had almost failed because she'd been too arrogant to listen to someone without the right background. And her talks resonated because they were honest about her failures rather than self-congratulatory about her growth. And other companies started examining their own biases. And slowly, incrementally, the conversation began to shift in the business world about what qualified someone as an expert and who deserved a seat at the table. 2 years after, Robert fixed the system that the credentialed experts couldn't. Tech Vision was thriving in ways that went beyond financial metrics. Employee satisfaction was up, because people felt valued regardless of their titles. Innovation was accelerating, because ideas were welcomed from all levels, and the company had developed a reputation as a place that recognized talent in all its forms. And Robert had been promoted to Chief Innovation Officer, a position that didn't even exist before, but was created specifically to harness his unique perspective and systems thinking. And he'd hired a diverse team that included people with PhDs from MIT, working alongside self-taught programmers from community centers, former military technicians alongside recent coding bootcamp graduates, and the diversity of educational backgrounds created a richness of perspective that generated breakthrough solutions that homogeneous teams would never have conceived. Amanda had become a different kind of leader, still demanding excellence, but now defining excellence by results and insight rather than pedigree. Still confident, but now that confidence was tempered by humility and the recognition that she didn't have all the answers. That leadership meant creating spaces where the best ideas could emerge from anyone, and she credited Robert publicly and privately with teaching her the most important lesson of her career, that respect should be given freely until someone proves they don't deserve it, rather than withheld until someone proves they do. On the anniversary of the day Robert had saved the company, Amanda gathered the leadership team and said, "I want to share something personal. Before I came to Tech Vision, I'd been fired from my previous CEO position. I failed because I was so focused on metrics and credentials that I forgot about the humans behind them. I created a toxic culture where people were afraid to admit they didn't know something, where asking for help was seen as weakness, and innovation died because everyone was protecting their image rather than solving problems. And when I came here, I brought those same toxic patterns, and they almost destroyed this company too. But Robert showed me a different way, not through lectures or criticism, but through the simple act of offering help, despite how he'd been treated. And that grace, that decision to do the right thing regardless of recognition or reward, that saved more than our production systems. It saved me from making the same mistakes again. It gave me a chance to become the leader I'd always claimed to be, but had never actually been." The meeting ended with Amanda announcing a new company value that would be carved into the wall of their headquarters lobby. Expertise lives everywhere. Wisdom is listening for it. And underneath that, a photo of Robert in his janitorial uniform standing next to the production system he'd saved. A reminder to everyone who entered the building that value and credentials were not synonyms, that the person you overlooked might be the person who saved you, and that true intelligence was recognizing knowledge in all its forms. Robert stood in front of that photo on the day it was unveiled, reading the messages that employees had left on a digital tribute board, and one message made him stop and read it twice. It was from a young woman who'd been hired as an intern through the scholarship program he'd helped create, and she wrote, "I grew up in foster care like you, taught myself coding from library computers, was told I'd never amount to anything without a degree. This program gave me a chance, but your story gave me hope. Thank you for showing people like me that we belong in these spaces, that our knowledge counts, that our different path doesn't make us less. You changed my life before we ever met, and now I get to work here and learn from you. I'll never forget that everyone deserves respect. Everyone has something to teach us, because that's what you taught this company, and through them, you taught me." Robert read that message and felt tears on his face because this was what it had all been for. The years of studying alone, the humiliations endured, the moment of deciding to help despite being dismissed. All of it had led to this creating pathways for others, changing systems that had excluded people like him, proving that knowledge mattered more than credentials, and that human worth couldn't be measured by institutional validation. And he thought about the younger version of himself, the 18-year-old aging out of foster care with nothing but determination and hunger to learn. And he wished he could tell that scared kid that it would be okay, that the path would be hard, but worthwhile, that staying curious and kind even when the world was cruel would eventually lead to standing in this lobby, honored not for credentials he didn't have, but for the knowledge he'd built and the grace he'd shown. And he hoped that somewhere, some other kid in a similar situation would see his story and know that they too had value, that they too belonged, that their different path was valid, and that the world was slowly, painfully, but genuinely learning to recognize expertise wherever it lived and wisdom wherever it spoke. Amanda found him standing there and said quietly, "Thank you, Robert, for saving this company, for teaching me humility, for showing all of us what leadership actually looks like. You could have walked away when I dismissed you. You had every right to, but you stayed and helped. And that decision changed hundreds of lives. Mine most of all." And Robert said something that captured the lesson both of them had learned. "We saved each other. Amanda, you gave me the recognition I'd been denied my whole life, the chance to use my knowledge openly instead of hiding it. And I gave you the wake-up call you needed before your arrogance destroyed everything you'd worked for. We both had something the other needed, and we both had to humble ourselves to receive it. Me, by offering help despite rejection. You, by accepting help despite your pride. And I think that's the real lesson here, that growth requires humility. That everyone has something to teach us if we're wise enough to learn, and that the credentials that matter most aren't the ones on your wall, but the ones in your character. The ability to recognize worth in others, to admit when you're wrong, to keep learning, regardless of what you think you already know, to treat everyone with dignity, regardless of their job title or educational background, because everyone, absolutely everyone, has value, and our job as humans is to see it, honor it, and create systems that recognize it, degrees or no degrees, titles or no titles. We're all just people trying to contribute our gifts to the world, and those gifts come in infinite forms, and they're all needed, they're all valuable, they're all worthy of respect.